Hello and welcome to the final session of the Virtual Midwest Staffing Conference. This is Cybersecurity and Working from Home, presented by Anjali Kamara. She's with Highland Risk Services for Worldwide Specialty Programs. Welcome, Anjali.
Thank you. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's session. Highland Risk has had a pretty long-standing relationship with Worldwide, and we were pretty excited when they approached us a few weeks ago about presenting this topic. It seemed extremely timely and relevant, and as I'm sure everyone can imagine, the cyber threats have evolved at a very rapid pace since that time. We're learning new things about the cyber context as much as we are learning about the virus itself almost on a weekly basis. So I'm sure everyone on the line has had their fair share of COVID-19 related webinars or news or content at this point. So I wanted to make sure that what you see today isn't only different by offering real examples of how cyber criminals are exploiting this virus, but that you also walk away with tips that are going to be relevant for your business and your clients. So just to give you a quick introduction of myself, again, my name is Anjali Kamara. I'm the cyber leader for Highland Risk Services, and my main focus at Highland is really just to help our broker partners upsell the product across their portfolios, and even more importantly, help their clients or you understand the value of cyber insurance as an integral part of their insurance program. So in terms of agenda today, we'll provide a brief overview of what RDP is, or Remote Desktop Protocol. We'll look at 5 ways that cyber criminals are exploiting COVID-19, and then we'll end with some useful best practice tips. So hopefully you can take from this presentation an understanding of the new threats that are poised for businesses as a result of the pandemic, and hopefully guidance and take away, guidance for preparing for these increased exposures. But first, I think it's really important that we look at overall volumes of cyber claims in 2018. Because the numbers really show that they have absolutely skyrocketed in the 2018 calendar year. This data is being pulled from CFC, which is one of the largest cyber insurers in the world. And the numbers that they are showing us here are that they're going to continue to increase in 2019 and have increased in 2019. But we're still finalizing that data. So I'd be happy to provide an update on that once CFC makes that available. They're actually at a stage where they're handling well over 100 new cyber claims every single month. That was pre-COVID-19. And that volume is really important because it means that they're consistently testing, they're critiquing, and they're reevaluating their claims infrastructure and proposition. Now, keep in mind that this is the claims volume from just one cyber insurer. So we can imagine how many claims and how many breaches are actually happening conclusively across all cyber insurance markets and have increased due to COVID-19. Now, a large part of the increase in claims volume that you see here in 2018 over 2017 is, of course, due to an increased policy count. Last year, CFC did write more cyber policies than they did in 2017. And there were even more policies in 2019. But even when we strip out that policy count and we look at the actual claims frequency, we can see that that has also doubled over the course of the past 2 years. That means one thing. Our customers, or you, are having more claims. And not only are you suffering more attacks, but you're ensuring that they're being notified to the cyber insurer. So, our customers expect their cyber insurance provider to be on point with the response that they provide and kind of hold their hand through the multitude of potential business damaging and business ending issues they face in that time. So it is useful to share with you also as well as the global claims trends that we're seeing through our data collected to really set the scene in terms of what cyber claims landscape looked like pre-COVID-19. It's important to note that this is heavily weighted towards businesses that are generating under 100 million in revenues or annual turnover. So though the chart does include anyone from startups to large national corporations, these 2019 annual stats of cyber claims are by frequency and not by severity. I can show you what that looks like at a different time as well. So a couple of points here. Number one, ransomware continues to dominate the scene in terms of frequency, and it certainly doesn't look like that's going to go away anytime soon. In fact, there are actually new implications where you have riot variants of ransomware requesting at $1 million, minimum of $1 million, as an extortion amount, which really drives those costs up, or the Maze group who steals confidential information and then threatens to release that information to the public as an incentive for companies to pay that demand. So whereas ransomware previously would have just been an extortion and triggered business interruption sections of coverage, there are now additional costs associated with forensics to determine if they have in fact exfiltrated data, legal fees where they have in fact done so, and then subsequent notification costs to customers. So it's also worth noting that in 2019 was the year of BEC scans, or business email compromise, which are demonstrated through data breach, hacks, and phishing links. Cybercrime and theft of funds as well are still an issue for businesses who might not be holding a large amount of data, but certainly might have a large amount of cash. And this is affecting all industries in all parts of the world. So we could spend the whole webinar just talking about that one slide. For the sake of moving on, if you do have any takeaway, it's that the large majority of claims are first-party driven. Cyber insurance should be looked at in a similar way as you would a kidnap and ransom policy. It's a service-led product by incident response costs, which means it is extremely important to think about who is actually there. Who are the experts that are picking up the phone should in fact the worst happen is the number reason why you should be buying the policy in the first place. Cybercrime, theft of funds, ransomware, and the cost to deal with notifying customers are all going to be first-party exposures. Okay, so let's dive in. Remote desktop protocol. What is RDP? So RDP is a built-in feature of Windows that allows you to work remotely on your computer. By default, it's only going to require a username and a password for authentication. The real problem with this lies when someone in the organization opens up RDP access to the general internet. It really doesn't take very long for an average cyber criminal to compromise RDP, gain access of your system and the network, and conduct any number of illicit activities, such as deploying ransomware, stealing data, distorting data, and using these compromised computers to attack other individuals or corporations. One common way to deal with RDP issue is to require that your employees use VPN or a virtual private network. And if they're going to use RDP, to do that over the VPN. So using a VPN is going to be the simplest way to ensure communication is encrypted between the end user and the organization. VPNs are tougher to compromise. And just as a side note, let's not get corporate VPN confused with the consumer VPNs that you might see on social media apps and commercials. The consumer VPNs are very privacy focused and are primarily for individuals to hide what they're doing on the internet from their internet service providers, or to connect from another location, such as if I wanted to get UK television, I could connect to my personal VPN like I'm accessing it from the UK. So while corporate VPNs have been around for a long time, we still see configurations on these that aren't optimal. We still see people just requiring username and passwords for authentication. And in today's environment, that just doesn't cut it. So it's important to require MFA, also known as multi-factor authentication. With MFA, even if an attacker has access to your username and your password, they're unable to log in because they lack additional factor that you must physically possess, like a phone call or a text message. So once your attacker gains access to your network, even through just one machine, the game is pretty much over. That is why it's going to be critically important to ensure that your employees are able to remotely log in on a network securely. So what we're seeing right now in the environment of COVID-19, the first thing that I want to talk about is at a high level is this whole situation is a better situation for attackers out there. It really is an ideal playground. They now have access to tons of internet-based information that people are dependent upon to actually operate their daily lives, tons of internet information that the organizations are using to apply for loans or grants or help or whatever the case may be. And then they have a very extended workforce out there in work from home situations where employees are less secure than they would typically be working from their office. So this slide here is speaking to government agencies is the #1 thing that we're seeing right now. We've seen it already where there are emails and websites that are even bundled with phone calls where attackers are posing as government agencies and trying to trick someone into doing something they just shouldn't do. This could be something as simple as clicking on a link, which is then infecting their computer, or it could be something as simple as sending a small payment and thinking that in return you're going to get some type of larger payment from the government. Obviously, there are a number of benefits to the attackers here. The biggest benefit to attackers that we're seeing currently during this pandemic is the extortion of money. Ransomware attackers are clearly loving this and are going after large amounts of money. And if they get one person that may be connected to their work network to click on something and infect themselves, they can work their way into the entire organization's network. Additionally, they may be just trying to steal information, especially in this pandemic. There's a ton of healthcare information that's out there being transmitted back and forth, and these particular tactics are being used to gain access to that. That information can be leveraged either by a nation state or it could be sold to other people that would be interested and would pay a pretty fair amount for that amount of information. So this next slide takes a different angle from what the attackers are trying to accomplish. This scenario tells the story of a food delivery company based in Germany that was targeted by attackers in an effort to extort money again. So in this instant, the attackers used a denial of service attack. And this is just where hackers take a large amount of computers, typically across the entire globe. These are commonly computers unsuspecting that they're even being used to do this and are typically people's personal computers. So what they'll do is they'll flood a website or a number of websites with an enormous amount of traffic that brings them to a halt. Think of this like an actual traffic jam. If you live in Chicago like I do, just imagine yourself on the Dan Ryan at 5 p.m. That's kind of what they're doing. In this particular case, the attackers successfully attacked the website of a food delivery service company, and therefore the people were not able to get on and order food delivery or check on their status, and at the same time the food delivery company wasn't able to receive orders that were placed immediately before the attack. So you think about this situation like today where people are very dependent on food delivery services, a lot more so prior to COVID-19. I know myself, I order probably twice a day, which is awful, but that's what I do. So in this situation, the attackers were doing this in order to extort money. The key here is that the attackers, just like with any other attacks that we've seen over the years, they're hoping to take advantage of the situation and a sense of urgency. So whether or not they're trying to threaten an employee that they need to do something very quickly or that they're going to get fired, or in this particular case, attacking a particular website or business that depends upon the internet to function, they know that they have a very high chance of getting paid and moving on to the next target. Again, you have to look at things from multiple angles, and if your business completely depends on the internet, you need to make sure that if you have an application, a website, or a combination of that, that you have the right security controls in place and that the correct monitoring mechanism is in place to make sure that you can respond to these things if they were to occur to you or your organization. So within chaos, there is always opportunity. And what we're seeing right now during this global pandemic is a significant amount of phishing and malicious emails being generated, attempting to use our fear, our uncertainty, and our doubt about COVID-19 to get us to take a specific action. That action is typically clicking on a malicious link in an email, opening a malicious attachment, or sharing your credentials in a false login. So this is an example of a phishing email on the screen, and I'll talk about a couple of others. We've seen coronavirus campaigns driving clicks via conspiracy theories, such as one that promises access to a confidential cure solution that has been developed by a secret medical science team. When victims click to gain access to the reported cure, they are instead directed to a fraudulent DocuSign login page that kind of collects their login credentials. Really, they're just putting a new front end on an existing infrastructure. We've seen this DocuSign login page to collect credentials on a number of different phishing campaigns. They've just kind of adjusted it for the current situation of the world. Another example of a phishing campaign is one supposedly sent by the U.S. Center of Disease Control, the CDC, claiming that the virus has reached their local region and is now more contagious than ever. The subject line reads, COVID-19 now airborne, increased community transmission. Again, this is feeding into people's fears about the virus that will make them more likely to click on something malicious within the message, enter their login credentials, and ultimately lead to a compromise of their personal and business systems. On this next slide, what you see here is a screenshot of the report of the actual exploits, meaning that someone has detected and reported that this is a malicious way of trying to get someone to click on something via an image. So what we've seen for a long time, and particularly are seeing an increase in this type of attack leveraging COVID-19 as a subject matter, is where people may want to look at an image, or in this particular example, a map of infection, to see where it's spreading and seeing where the deaths are and all those facets of information, and then they click on it. So this might be something that is a legitimate map, but the hackers were able to put a malicious code behind it, or they integrate it within it, to where when someone goes to it, it is a legitimate graphic that they're seeing, but the background, in the background, something else is launching on that person's computer, which is going to compromise it for ransomware or for some other malicious purpose. So again, preying on people's sense of need, their sense of urgency, or concern to take advantage of the situation. We're also seeing this on people's mobile applications as well. Recently, there's been a large number of reports of mobile applications, either with new ones or older ones that are being updated that might have malicious code in them. So whether you're an Android or Apple device user, you need to be very aware and do your research when installing a new app or using an app that you might not have used in a long time to make sure everything's okay with it. The vendors are doing a pretty decent job of trying to remove those applications as quickly as they can. But again, people are very hungry for new information, and these hackers are hoping that you click on it before these platform vendors like Google or Apple figure it out and remove it for you. So this last example is actually one that you wouldn't think of when you think of a cyber breach. But if you've thought about how the money transfers, what happens when you send Bitcoin for decryption of the ransomware, or when there's wire fraud that happens, how do they actually get their hands on the money? This will kind of give you some idea of another way cyber criminals are taking advantage of COVID-19. So we're all very aware that coronavirus has disrupted our normal and our everyday lives. We've seen a significant amount of layoffs and other financial hardships that have left people in some desperate positions. And this only provides another way for criminals to capitalize on the suffering of others to recruit what we call money mules. So money mules are individuals who are recruited to help criminals transfer the money to disguise fraudulent transactions. A criminal who drains a stolen bank account won't typically take the money directly, but instead transfer it to a mule who then passes the cash along to the criminal in exchange for a small cut. These mules may or may not know the role they're playing in laundering the money, but carry a much higher risk in being identified by law enforcement than the criminals who actually hire them. So I recently read an article about a fake travel organization called Vastly Healthcare Foundation. They've been leveraging job postings related to helping coronavirus patients to recruit money mules. The new hires are given a series of busy work tasks to identify who's willing to actually follow through on work and to make the recruit feel useful. And then finally, the new hire is asked to process what is called a donation, which of course entails transferring stolen money for the criminals. So now that I've covered the top 5 ways cyber criminals are exploiting COVID-19, what do you do now as a business? This slide here shows 3 key elements or key controls that we focused on in the earlier slides of the presentation. So the first one is multi-factor authentication. In today's world, if you're not using some form of MFA to get onto your corporate network or your email, this is actually really alarming. We talked about, earlier about how 2019 was the year of BCE, or business compromise emails. And in every one of those cases, if they had had some type of MFA, those cases would have been avoided entirely. One thing people don't really realize is that, do you implement an MFA? What a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of the most common social media platforms or websites have MFA capabilities. And if you use these Facebooks or Twitters or Instagrams, you should be able to enable those MFAs on each of those sites. There are a number of applications out there that facilitate this. The mainstream ones are the ones most people use, like Google Authenticator. In a lot of cases, they may specify that you must use a certain type of authenticator, but most of the time it's a very generic form, and you can use one authenticator for all of your uses. In my particular case, I have one application that I use MFA for on all of my work-related stuff, and then I use a completely different application for all of my personal MFA. It's just easier for me to manage if I keep them separate. The password vault or manager is a very good and effective way of securely storing your passwords. Obviously, in many ransomware attacks, a lot of times the hackers get in because the passwords are really easy to guess, or the passwords were somewhere out there on the dark web because they were previously compromised. Oftentimes people don't want to create a complicated password because they have to remember it. I'm one of those people. So the use of a password manager solves that problem, and there are a number of mainstream password managers and vaults that you can use. I've listed the top two here, 1Password and LastPass. Both of these do operate across platforms, meaning that they'll work on Windows, they'll work on Mac, on Android, and on iOS. The good thing about these is that you'll typically have a master password to get into it. And then once you've used that master password, then you can get all of the passwords within there. These password managers also support MFA. So when you get into the password vault, especially if the application sees you're logging in from somewhere different, it might prompt you with a two-factor authentication prompt to make sure that you are who you say you are. And then the last one is the concept of VPN, which we talked about a little bit earlier. One of the things to note about SSL VPN is that it is typically there to secure the communication between a remote user and their organization. What we see with regards to attacks that have taken advantage of VPNs is a couple of things. One, we see a VPN that uses a weak password, and two, they don't have MFA. So it's really important within security to just do the basics, or what we call the foundational items. In the front lines of cybersecurity are your end users, your employees, and your teammates. And doing proper cybersecurity training for your team is really one of the most critical parts. We typically see at a minimum training on an annual basis, which can be done, online. It can be done via webinar, or your company could bring in a security partner to help conduct that training. But when you have a significant change to either how your business operates or have significant changes happening in the world like COVID-19, it's really important to provide refreshers and updates on that training. And that can be a combination of sending out emails with reminders or supplemental trainings in areas like remote access working environments. In addition to refresher trainings, testing the competency of your employees with phishing tests on your environment and employees is also a great way to help your employees feel secure in this very unsecure environment that we're living in. And again, implementing things like MFA is pertinent. I don't think I can really stress that enough. I know the deployment can sometimes be challenging, but the users will get through it, and it will become a normal process for them, and it will give you a significant reduction in possible security infiltrations. Patching of systems is critically important, and another very foundational aspect of cybersecurity, making sure that not only are your operating systems patched and up to date, but also your third-party applications like Adobe and Office, Microsoft Office software, all up to date. And then eventually turning that into a full vulnerability management program. This is really where you're not only doing patching, but you're doing a scan of your environment to ensure the patching done in your environment on both internal and external devices. And then in the don't column, here is really just focus on not clicking links that are malicious. You're not downloading attachments from unknown or untrusted sources, and you're really taking a look at something if it just sets off in your senses that something isn't really right, and doing some additional due diligence. So next, let's talk a little bit about incident response. It's really important to continually figure out a better way to respond to a particular cyber incident. A lot of times companies don't have an incident response plan, or if they do, they're very generic and not very specific to their business, or they're either really outdated. I would have to say probably it's equal to not having one as having one and not testing it. More importantly, with an incident response plan, the time to review it is prior to having an incident, of course, and not when an incident actually occurs. One thing we need to take note is if you have a corporate policy that includes incident response, that incident response is probably not likely to include work from home. So if your organization is allowing people to work from home and leverage a personal device, you need to make sure that your policies reflect that appropriate use. The other big question is that when COVID-19 came about, the first question many risk management vendors pose is, do all your employees need VPN? A lot of times you find out that many people can work just fine with just email. In many cases, in other cases, employees may need email and access to some files. So having some remote secure file access solution in place can remove the need for a VPN. So why do we care about that? Well, typically, if you just take an employee and what they do at work and you turn on your VPN for them, that means that they have access that they would typically have at work now extended to their home. Most of the time after some digging, we find that employees have far more access than they actually need to do their work. So again, this is an appropriate time to ask yourself and your employees, what do you absolutely need to get your job done? And to try to limit them to what they have. So if something does happen in their home that could potentially compromise the rest of the organization's network, that impact is minimized because you've basically stripped away or reduced a lot of that employee's access. One other important takeaway is that a lot of companies that we speak to discuss their best practices and the great things that they've implemented from the controls perspective, and yet a lot of those companies are still subject to incidents occurring regardless. And that's largely in part of the human factor that's gotten around those controls they've implemented. From a cyber insurance perspective, I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that cyber insurance acts as a dual layer of protection to any control that's put in place in the same way that you would look at a crime policy. If a business has a burglar alarm on their door, they wouldn't not get a crime policy for the theft of the items in the building. If they have a sprinkler in the building, they wouldn't avoid getting property insurance. So in the same exact way, where we're looking at tangible exposures, on the intangible side, we should be looking at great, you've got all these great controls in place and you have best-in-class security systems, but cyber insurance is there for that dual layer of protection. And it's important, especially in this time, that we re-emphasize what also comes along with a good cyber insurance policy. Most reputable cyber insurers offer a full standalone cyber product, will also offer some element of proactive risk management services at varying degrees. These listed here on the screen are 5 risk management services that are completely free with CFC's policy, one of them being a cyber incident response planner. And as I mentioned before, one that is best used when used in advance and not in a panic situation. But it definitely gives a good template that points businesses in the right direction and gives key points when putting one together. Just a helpful reminder for clients that these services are available, and obviously the better they can be at being proactive, the better the cyber carrier can be on the reactive side if those risk management services are used. So, you know, these things are typically free with most reputable cyber carriers, and I would really advocate using risk management services to better secure your companies and your systems. That's all I have today on cyber and working from home. I hope it was helpful and useful.